Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the keynote today. My name is Katie Natanel. I'm a senior lecturer here at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Jessica Barnes. I'm also the executive editor of MERIP, Middle East Research and Information Project, which Jessica has written for actually most recently in February. We do have issues of our most recent, copies of our most recent issue, 306, The State of Iraq, which are free. It's a special print run of this issue, so come on up and grab a copy. We've got boxes and boxes of more, so pick one of those up. But it's great to see everyone. Thank you for making the time this evening to come and listen to this amazing talk. So just a little housekeeping. The format for this evening will be a 45-minute presentation with some really beautiful images from Jessica, followed by a Q&A session, which I'll facilitate. So we have some roving microphones, and I'll indicate who is, obviously who is the next person to speak. And if you can identify yourself, preferably with your name and where you've come from institutionally, that would be great. And do wait for the microphone as that reaches you. So we can get started. I'll read a little about Jessica and then I'll hand over. Jessica Barnes is the associate professor at the University of South Carolina. She is in the Department of Geography and School of Earth, Ocean, and Environment, and her work examines cultural, political, and material dimensions of resource use and environmental change in the Middle East and beyond. Her publications include Cultivating the Nile, The Everyday Politics of Water in Egypt, and that came out in 2014 with Duke University Press. Climate Cultures, Anthropological Perspectives on Climate Change, which was co-edited with Michael Dove and published in 2015 by Yale University Press. And then Staple Security, Bread and Wheat in Egypt, again with Duke University Press, and this was just in 2022. She's also published articles in a range of journals, including Cultural Anthropology, Journal of Royal Anthropological Institute, Geoforum, and Nature Climate Change. So some really impressive publications. And also with MERIP, again, in February, your piece, The Ukraine War, Grain Trade and Bread in Egypt, which I learned so much from and keep going back to as like the golden standard for what MERIP can and should do. So thank you for that. Her research has been supported in terms of grants from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Wenner Gren Foundation, and also the Rockefeller Foundation. And this evening, we're going to hear from her about placing the environment in Middle East studies beyond the single story. So I hand to you, and thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. Can you hear me all right at the back? That sounds good. Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to come and present to you all today, and thank you all for coming. I'm really thrilled to be here and to be part of this conference. So in 2018, The Economist magazine ran an article titled "Climate Change is Making the Arab World More Miserable." Under the tagline, "Middle East and North Africa, Too Hot to Handle," bold type warned readers to expect longer droughts, hotter heat waves, and more frequent dust storms. In a mere 25 words, this headline captured both an impending doom and several common stereotypes about the region. A climate crisis adding to what is already a wretched place, compounded by incompetent governments that can't cope. Now, The Economist is perhaps too easy a foil, but this narrative of crisis is something that we see all around us, in policy reports, on the news, in politicians' statements, even in the call for papers for this conference. It's a narrative that revolves around a sense of lack, a lack of water, of cultivable land, of environmental awareness, good governance. A narrative that places resources at the center of the frame, for which both abundance, in the case of oil, and scarcity, in the case of water, are understood to be problematic. A narrative that paints a broad, sweeping picture, focused on nations and their governments, with little attention to differences within countries or communities. This crisis narrative matters because it obfuscates as much as it reveals. It leads to a particular understanding of what is to be done and by whom. It opens up some courses of action while closing down others. It can be used to justify policy interventions, legitimize government action, or authorize violence. So in my talk today, I want to discuss some of the stories that we tell about the environment in the Middle East. What themes and actors do these stories contain? Where do they take place? How do they begin and when do they end? Who gets to tell them? Thinking through these questions is important as we consider the place of the environment in Middle East studies. But perhaps the first thing we have to address is what exactly we mean by this word, the environment. As an environmental anthropologist, I think of the term broadly as the world in which we live, a world which we both shape and which shapes us. So to me, tapping soil nutrients and diverting water to grow a crop is an environmental issue. Channeling water through a city for people to drink and to remove their waste is an environmental issue. Moving grain around a country and across oceans to produce a staple food is an environmental issue. But what I found when conducting fieldwork in the Middle East and talking about my research interests and my disciplinary background was that this word environment, al-bi'a, didn't hold wide resonance. This made me reflect both on my own subject positioning and on the position of those with whom I was interacting. In everyday conversation with people like taxi drivers or rural women or farmers, the word environment seldom, if ever, seemed to come up. In spaces where I did hear people talking about the environment, in conversations with policymakers or with various kinds of experts, I noticed that most seemed to understand the term within very narrow bounds, encompassing things like solid waste management, nature conservation, or pollution control. Sort of nice extras to be considered when other development priorities are dealt with, rather than a core component of human livelihoods and well-being. The ministries of environment that are responsible for these issues in Egypt, but also elsewhere within the region, often lack power, divorced from ministries of agriculture or water, despite the fact that those ministries also deal with issues that I would consider to be deeply environment-related. This narrow framing of the term and the positioning within bureaucracies plays into a particular way of thinking about the environment as distinct from other core dimensions of life, and moreover, as a problem space alone. It reinforces that narrative that we see in The Economist, a single story of environmental crisis, a story that does a particular kind of political work. So, inspired by a wonderful TED talk by the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, I want to reflect on what she calls the danger of a single story. Now, all of us who work in the Middle East are very familiar with essentialized narratives. What I want to argue today is that as we think of the place of the environment in Middle East studies, we need to push against reductive understandings of the environment as a space of crisis and resource scarcity, and to consider it in a more capacious and nuanced manner. Looking beyond the single story, and there's lots of fantastic work coming out in the field that's doing just this, requires that we do three things. First, we, as researchers, have to be in places. As a body in space, we can learn through our sensorial engagements, seeing how a local engineer reacts to a farmer's complaint, hearing how women describe the challenges that they face getting water, tasting different kinds of bread. Away from formal interview spaces, we can understand more by observing what emerges in everyday conversations and social interactions. Venturing outside capital cities, we can gain insight into how things look from other, much more difficult to reach locations. Second, we have to take key resources not as a given, but as something that comes into being. This means tracing day-to-day acts that produce material things of value, whether that may be opening an irrigation gate to let water into a canal, creating an infrastructure to pull oil up from under the ground, planting seeds to grow a crop, or mixing together flour, water, salt, and yeast to make bread. Third, we need to look across scales to see the multiple ways in which environmental problems are understood and articulated in relation to the spaces in which people live and work. So the global or national story, like this discussion of climate change solutions taking place in a Cairo conference room, may not be the same as the local. The interests of a household may not align with those of the state. We need to look at these connections between differently scaled places while recognizing that for the actors in question, those places aren't necessarily connected and their interests don't always line up. Furthermore, we need to understand that while bigger scale stories may seem more important, it's pretty difficult to compete with narratives of global heating. Sometimes small stories situated in particular places may tell us more. So to illustrate, I want to give you three examples from my own research that show the power and the limits of the single story, as well as what lies beyond. The first single story I'm going to look at is that Egypt doesn't have enough water. The second is the story of climate crisis. And the third is that of the bread riot. So my examples are all Egypt-specific, but I think the broader points I'm trying to make really transcend that context, and I'm sure that many of you who work in other parts of the region will see a number of parallels. In talking through these examples, I hope to open up space for thinking about some of the other kinds of stories that we might tell about ecologies in the Middle East. For only through multiple stories, told from multiple locations, can we really understand the political and social dimensions of complex environmental issues. So, to start with my water example, I'm in the university office of Dr. Sara in Cairo when I see the image. Just a simple piece of paper with a printout from Google Earth taped to the wall. It's April 2009. In some ways, the image is strikingly familiar. The snaking line of the Nile heading north from Lake Nasser, the leaf-like shape of Fayoum jutting off from the Nile Valley where I conducted my fieldwork, the wedge of the Nile Delta, desert on either side. The classic image of water in the midst of scarcity. An image that, as Timothy Mitchell has argued, is often used to encapsulate Egypt's key challenge as a battle between geography and demography. But there's something jarring about the image. West of Lake Nasser, in the desert, several black blobs of water. What is that, I ask. Despite having conducted a year of research on water and irrigation in Egypt by this point, I've never heard of water in this space. Dr. Sara tells me that these are the Toshka lakes. Now, the word Toshka is familiar. I've heard plenty of talk about the largely failed effort to reclaim large tracts of desert land with water pumped from Lake Nasser. But this isn't the same thing. This, Dr. Sara tells me, is water being spilled into the desert because there's too much in the reservoir. The Ministry of Water constructed a spillway from Lake Nasser back in 1978, very aware of the danger posed by the possibility of the reservoir overflowing. It didn't have to use the spillway, though, until the early 2000s, when a string of high rainfall years in the source regions of the Nile saw the reservoir approaching dangerously high levels. As ministry engineers began to release water into the spillway, easing pressure on the reservoir, lakes began to grow in the desert. So this photo was taken in 2002, a few years before that Google Earth image. When Dr. Sara explains to me that this isn't water being put to productive use, I'm shocked. I've just come out of a year of fieldwork in Fayoum, in which I heard many farmers complaining about scarcity, saw canals lying empty, crops withering. I never realized that all that time, in the south of the country, millions of cubic meters of water were evaporating from the surface of the desert. Egypt's big challenge, Dr. Sara tells me, is how to store water. It can't store as much water as it gets. Don't say I said this, but in some ways, Egypt gets too much water. Dr. Sara, and I'm using a pseudonym here, is uncomfortable about acknowledging this because she understands how her comments undermine the Egyptian government's narrative of scarcity. A reminder that sort of even as we grapple with getting beyond single stories, we have to recognize the power of these essentialized narratives. In the few years following this 2009 conversation, the rains over the East African highlands where the Nile begins weren't so abundant. With less water flowing down the river, the reservoir levels subsided and the ministry no longer needed to use the spillway, and the lakes in the desert shrunk. By 2012, they were almost gone. Now, just as a side note, you can see those circles of center pivot irrigated agriculture. This is the beginning of the Toshka reclamation project, which draws water from that Sheikh Zayed canal, which comes from Lake Nasser. But let's pause for a minute on this next image, snapped by an astronaut circling the Earth in the International Space Station in 2021. After record-breaking floods in 2020 and high floods again in 2021, the Ministry of Water started once again to utilize the spillway. The Toshka lakes are now fuller than ever before. There are even a couple of new lakes as the water has flowed into depressions to the north and south. You can also see how there's much more agriculture now because President Sisi's administration has revitalized the Toshka project, But these fields aren't tapping into those Toshka lakes because the Toshka lakes are saline. So there's this kind of interesting juxtaposition here of, those green cycles encapsulate this miracle, this achievement of making the desert bloom. But just next to that is all this water that's just being lost to the atmosphere through evaporation. This is 2021, the same year that 800 miles away, Ethiopia announced that it had completed 80% of the construction work on the Grand Renaissance Dam. Speaking to the ongoing tensions between the countries of the Nile Basin, President Sisi warned of inconceivable instability in the region if Egypt's water supply was affected. Such a major dam on the river that constitutes 96% of Egypt's water supply poses a deep threat. Describing Egypt as the world's driest country, Sisi noted that he understood the need for development in Ethiopia and was ready to cooperate, but not if it would affect the Egyptian citizen by any means. Egypt, he said, can't bear any more shortages. But what we see here in this image isn't a problem of shortage, it's one of excess. Now, my sort of point here isn't to try and replace one simple story with another one. There are good reasons why water managers need to maintain water levels in Lake Nasser within a certain range, and also why they aren't able to release that water through the irrigation network. It's also understandable that they wouldn't advertise their use of the spillway widely. And it's understandable why Egyptians would feel fearful of an upstream dam. But what I want to do in talking about this case is to underscore the nuances. Even as we acknowledge that this is a country that has no rivers that rise within its borders, much of which receives less than a centimetre of rainfall a year, we have to also acknowledge that this lack isn't experienced evenly. Moments of excess at the Aswan High Dam sit alongside scarcity in Fayoum. There is no single story of water in Egypt. And the problem with assuming that there is that it can misdirect us to ask the wrong questions or to forge ineffective policy responses. So, instead of telling a Malthusian-tinged narrative of a nation with a limited resource and rapidly growing population facing crisis, we might start our story in other places. Like with this Bahar in Fayoum province. His job is to open and close the gates in this weir, so as to control the flow of water from one canal to another. When I visit one day with Ahmed, a low-level engineer from the Water Ministry, the Bahar greets us warmly, inviting us into his office and getting us cold sodas. His tone changes, though, when Ahmed comments that the water is low at the end of the canal. Who told you the water was low? The Bahar asks defensively. He takes out a large notebook that's full of this sort of very meticulously written set of figures and points to the entry for today, 26, which means 26 centimetres between the crest of the weir and the surface of the water. Ahmed agrees with him. That's just what he'd noted too when we visited the end of the canal. But we'd also talked with some farmers who had said that the water levels had been lower on previous days. Maybe, the Bahar acknowledges. There'd been a holiday, the Mawlid, so nobody had been working the gate those few days. A matter of little consequence to him, but significant to the farmers whose fields had needed irrigating on those days. Ahmed presses on, recounting a conversation we'd had with a farmer who told us that his onion crop had been ruined for lack of water. The Bahar refuses to accept this. The onions must have died of a disease, he said, because the farmer failed to spray them properly. As we leave the Bahar's office, Ahmed comments to me that the Bahar doesn't like to admit that he was wrong. He was also always having to juggle competing demands on the water supply that he controls. The two local district engineers both give him money on the side. In return, they ask him to open up the gates into their canals a little bit more at night so that the farmers in their districts don't complain. It's like a game of cat and mouse, he says. In centering the big narrative of scarcity, we miss the ability to see how the resource comes into being for characters like this Bahar and the farmers who live alongside the canal. This water in this place, which is this resource of such critical value without which people wouldn't be able to cultivate their land, isn't a given. But its presence and absence isn't a function of how much water Egypt receives from the Nile. It's a function of power. It's about who is better positioned to get this irrigation official to open up the gate so that water flows into their canal. So for the farmer whose onions have died, whose land is at the end of the canal, it's not that he's unaware of the bigger Nile story, But the narrative of water in which he lives and has influence, or rather doesn't have all that much influence, is more confined, rooted in this place. Alternatively, we could begin our water story here with Noha, washing dishes in an irrigation ditch. Noha has a tap in her home, but she finds it easier to wash the large pots and pans with which she cooks in the stream. Water is vital for her day-to-day tasks like cooking, cleaning, and drinking. But the combined domestic use of her and hundreds of millions of other Egyptians within their homes constitutes just 10% of the nation's total water use, a tiny fraction when compared to the amount used to feed crops. Yet these two uses, domestic and agricultural, compete for the same water. So drinking water also comes from the Nile through the irrigation network, via water treatment stations, and then into the piped system. Sometimes the water supply in Noha's home cuts off for days at a time. She, like many other poorer Egyptians, faces scarcity, but a scarcity not of low water levels in a canal, but of taps not working or water dripping out that's too dirty to drink. Water cut-offs are particularly common during the annual canal maintenance period, when the need to empty canals so that they can be repaired takes priority over the need to sustain the drinking water supply. Noha's family has a water tank on the roof of their house, which they use for storage. But during the year when I take this photo, the pump is broken, so they can't use it. When no water comes from the tap in her home, she has to walk to fill plastic containers from a public tap, which draws on groundwater. Noha is all too aware of her positioning in the hierarchy of recipients and of the reasons why she experiences this resource as scarce. The tap is far away at the end of the village. Akhil dunya, she says. She feels the weight on her head. Or we could turn to the urban context and approach our water story from the offices of the landscape architects drawing up plans for Egypt's new capital city in the desert east of Cairo. The plans include a 6,200-acre park, 6 times the size of New York Central Park, with grass and trees attractively laid out around a central water feature. They call this the Green River, to parallel the Nile that winds its way through Egypt's old capital. Looking at these plans, I ponder how much water will be needed to feed this greenery. State officials say that they'll use treated wastewater to irrigate the park, but I wonder about whether this will really happen. At present, the only infrastructure supplying water to the new capital in construction are 2 pumping stations that transfer fresh water from the Nile. All this water flowing out of the river into the desert, rather than to farmers downstream, and all for a mega project dream. Across these scenes, we see the times and spaces of scarcity, but also those of plenty. What we learn from these 3 different starting points is that whilst water scarcity certainly poses a problem, it doesn't necessarily do so in the way that we might think. Beyond a national level story of a country with limited resources, we see the role played by government officials at multiple levels in determining who gets water and who doesn't, from those operating the spillway on Lake Nasser to those who open and close the gates of weirs. We see the everyday labor of women seeking to meet their families' needs. We see the politically laden decisions about who is a worthy user of the nation's limited water. By getting beyond the single story, we understand more about how people's interactions with water are placed in particular spaces and relations of power. So whereas a single narrative of national water scarcity feeds into a simplistic policy solution, it's either really about increasing the water supply through things like desalination, or trying to get people to use less water through things like modern irrigation technologies. When we open up to a multiplicity of stories, we see instead the necessity of asking difficult political questions about who gets the water that is available, what kind of water they receive, and why. This is just one example of how in-depth scholarship can lead us to help us break through some of these dominant narratives about the Middle East that have been so often used to justify government spending, international donor assistance, population control, and foreign policy. So turning now to my second example. It's a November day in 2011, and several hundred policymakers, water managers, and scientists from the Middle East and beyond have gathered in Cairo for the second Arab Water Forum. In the conference room of a 5-star hotel, a scientist from Egypt's water ministry stands behind the podium. She presses a key on her computer and brings up her next PowerPoint slide. On one side of the slide, there's a map of the Nile Basin with a bold arrow pointing to a site along the curvy blue line of the Nile in northern Sudan. This is the town of Dongola, one of the main hydrological monitoring stations along the Nile. Next to the map, there's a graph. The x-axis shows the months of the year. The y-axis is labeled flow changes and ranges from minus 50% to plus 50%. The scientist explains that the multiple wiggly lines on the graph indicate the results of her team's computer modeling studies. These studies take projections for rainfall over the East African highlands from climate models and input them into a hydrological model to forecast Nile flows at Dongola in the year 2050. You'll note how some of the lines are above the 0 mark and some of them are below. The scientist explains that they found from the result of all these studies that the annual flow of the Nile in 2050 will be between minus 13% and plus 36% of its historical average. It might go down or it might go up. This story goes against the common narrative of climate crisis in Egypt, which has been used to justify many an application for donor funding and to boost the nation's position in Nile Basin negotiations. There's a possibility that in terms of its water supply, climate change could be good for Egypt. Now, this doesn't negate the very real challenges that climate change poses to Egypt, along with other countries of the Middle East. Higher temperatures, sea level rise, more weather extremes. But it highlights the complexity, an inconvenient truth that Egypt might have more water in a climate-changed future. So I wonder what other stories we might tell about climate change. We might look, for instance, at the story presented in a government report, like this adaptation strategy written by the Ministry of Water. This report was written by a water resource scientist who has a PhD in civil engineering and heads one of the ministry's research institutes. He understands uncertainty, but he also understands his position within the Egyptian bureaucracy. He notes that there is some disagreement between the general circulation models about whether the Blue Nile will get wetter or drier. Roughly 2/3 of the models project an increase in precipitation in East Africa, while the others expect reduced precipitation. It's notable, though, that he doesn't take the fact that the majority of the models project a wetter outcome to conclude that an increase in flows is more likely. Instead, he notes, this means that the future of climate change in East Africa is uncertain. The author ends this section with a plea. This uncertainty, he writes, shouldn't paralyze policymakers and water managers. Any decrease in the total supply of water, coupled with an expected increase in consumption, would have drastic impacts. The transition within this one paragraph is striking. The author begins with an acknowledgement of how most models indicate that East African precipitation is likely to increase, leading to increased Nile discharge, but he ends by urging action related only to the other scenario, that of a drier basin and increasing scarcity. In doing so, he subtly reinforces concerns about scarcity, in effect erasing the possibility of an increase in flows. There's a politics, therefore, to the stories that we tell about climate change. This scenario of reduced flows plays into Egypt's interest when it's seeking to protect its right to water in the Nile Basin. And what about those for whom climate change doesn't feature in their stories? Let us zoom in, for instance, on a meeting in an agricultural cooperative. The room is small and hot. Cobwebs hang from the ceiling and a fan whirs overhead. A group of farmers are meeting with an engineer from the water ministry. The conversation revolves around the lack of water in the farmer's canal. The main problem, begins one farmer, is stealing. There are 60 illegal pumps on the canal and the Bahar is just standing there. Another farmer speaks about an upstream canal. If that canal didn't take so much water, they'd have enough. Now we're in June, he says. In July and August, it will only get worse, what with the cultivation of rice. An old man with less than an acre of land chimes in. It's all the large farmers' fault, he says. He's gone to complain many times, he tells the group, but nobody listens to me. The situation's unfair, they conclude. We're wronged. Mazloom. For these farmers, those wiggly lines on the graph indicating fluctuations in the water supply are an everyday lived reality. They can see any changes in their water supply and they talk about them at length. But they link those fluctuations not to changing rainfall patterns in East Africa, but rather to other farmers buying illegal pumps and growing rice, local bahars not enforcing the rules, engineers allocating more water to another canal, and their complaints falling on deaf ears. They recognize the political and technical decisions that act as intermediaries between the water falling from the sky as rain and them receiving it. However much or little water enters Egypt, whether due to climate change or due to the action of upstream countries in the basin, these farmers understand that the most politically connected and influential among them will always receive the water that they need. The crisis they face isn't so much that of a novel climate crisis, but an age-old crisis of those in marginalized positions being squeezed while the powerful have plenty. So, in our concerns about addressing climate change and thinking carefully about its impacts and the need for adaptation, and I certainly share those concerns, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that climate is but one of a number of factors that shapes the availability of key resources like water. We mustn't fall into the danger of what Mike Holm terms climate reductionism, the way of seeing the world in which the future becomes reduced to climate alone. In the close read of the government report, we see how deep uncertainties over the impact of climate change on resources like the Nile can stymie policy responses or can, alternatively, be selectively interpreted to serve strategic interests. In the meeting in the agricultural cooperative, we see what can't be captured in climate models within a future written in computer code and mathematical equations. Both these moments raise questions about the best way to respond to climate change. Any program for promoting adaptation that fails to take into consideration this mediating layer of political and social relations is unlikely to effectively address the needs of the most vulnerable. Turning now to my final example of bread. It's a bright day in December 2018, and I'm standing beside a bakery in Cairo that sells the government-subsidized Baladi bread. You can see the window, just see the window here when there's a small line of people standing up for their loaves. I lean against a wall, looking at my phone as though waiting for someone, and watch and wait. A stooped old lady in a long black galabert is at the booth, where she's just bought around 40 loaves of bread. The server passes her the bread on a rack made of palm fronds. A young woman helps her carry the bread to one side. In front of this particular bakery, there are this set of metal shelves you can see behind that silver car, which people can use. The old woman pushes her rack onto the shelves and starts moving around the loaves. She takes a few from the front and places them on the back, a few from the left and places them on the right. She turns some of them over. After several minutes, she starts packing her bread into a plastic bag that she's brought with her, then pauses, realizing they're still hot. She glances at the traffic, waits, reaches out to feel her loave's temperature. Only when the bread is fully cooled does she pile up the remainder into stacks, put them in her bag, and depart. This isn't the kind of story that we typically hear about bread in Egypt. It isn't about calls for bread among protesters in the 2011 revolution, or about the famous bread riots of 1977, so often evoked by politicians and journalists to underscore the importance of cheap, decent bread to the Egyptian people. It isn't about long lines at bakeries. It isn't about the huge costs and inefficiencies of Egypt's massive subsidized bread program. It's the story of a mundane, seemingly insignificant task. This woman has the loaves that she needs, and she's handling them to make sure that they'll be pleasant to eat. Look around Cairo, and you'll see many people doing something similar, carving out slivers of urban space to lay out their bread, a hood of a car, a piece of newspaper on the floor, carefully checking their loaves to make sure they aren't torn or burnt, stacking them into piles, then carrying them home to their families. When we set aside the bread crisis narrative and move from a national story to an individual one, we see these everyday ways of living with bread, the pace of life with one's loaves, and the places where bread's characteristics are coming into being. So whereas discussions of bread riots really put the government as the central protagonist, it's up to the Egyptian government to ensure that the nation doesn't run out of wheat, that the bakeries produce enough decent bread, and that the bread is affordable if they want to stop people from taking to the streets. In these moments at the bakery, we see how those who buy this bread also play a role. These practices of handling bread may be small, but they are in fact critical to the quality of the bread that people get to eat. If customers were to place hot bread directly into a plastic bag, the hot air would condense on the inside of the bag, rendering the bread soggy. Egyptians talk about this as the bread sweating. No one likes sweaty bread. If customers didn't stack their loaves properly, they would crumple or tear. In other words, one reason why people are happy with the nature of the subsidized bread, why they aren't rioting in the streets, is because they're handling it with care to ensure that their loaves arrive at home with a shape, texture, and taste that is pleasing. So just to pan out for a second, what we see in moments like these at the bakery is an example of textured human experience. These practices could tell a story about food or about infrastructures or poverty or policy or about all these things at once. They're part of everyday life in the Middle East, which anyone working and living in the region will be able to identify with. And they underscore the value of ethnographic depictions in countering discourses otherwise dominated by generalized claims like the risk of the bread riot or numbers like the costs of the subsidy program. In my recent book, I argue that these day-to-day practices of handling bread are one of the ways in which individual Egyptians work to ensure that they have good bread to eat. I introduced the concept of staple security to describe the lengths to which people go and the feelings that come with the struggle to secure a consistent, decent staple food. The book goes beyond the single story of security, as meaning countering extremism, preventing terror attacks, or reinforcing borders, to consider how security infuses daily life. So part of the book is about national security. It's about the Egyptian government making sure that there's enough wheat in stock and the bread being made to maintain stability. But it's also about security in the sense of mothers and fathers going each morning to the bakery so that their family will have bread to eat, or farmers planting wheat so that their households will have flour to bake with. As the book traces wheat from its seed through its cultivation and import into its transformation to various kinds of bread, it offers some different places from which we might begin our analysis of this staple food. We might, for example, look at the story of Sisi and the silos. Here, the president is inaugurating a silo complex by the Nile, which was financed by a grant from the UAE and built by a Danish company. These silos will hold wheat for the subsidized bread program. Producing 300 million loaves of baladi bread, subsidized bread a day, takes about 9 million tons of wheat. The government buys some of this grain from Egyptian farmers and imports the remainder. But it can't buy wheat unless it has somewhere to store it. And at present, Egypt doesn't have enough silos. As one Egyptian agricultural specialist explained to me, say farmers wanted to sell all their wheat to the government rather than consuming about half of it as they currently do, there won't be anywhere to put it. And there's a sort of really interesting parallel here with the water example that I talked about earlier. Egypt feels this sense of vulnerability being reliant on foreign wheat, just as it feels vulnerable being reliant on the Nile. And so there's this imperative to have a good amount of the resource in stock, in storage within its borders. But holding a resource in place, whether we're talking about water or grain, isn't always easy. So this image of Sisi and the silos speaks to a national level story that takes us up the supply chain to understand more about how Egypt's cheap bread comes into being. It's about state investment in a particular infrastructure driven by a commitment to ensure the provision of bread to the Egyptian people, underpinned by the fear of what might happen if it didn't. The presence of Sisi being guided around this model by the Major General in charge of the project hints at the political stakes. Or we might begin our story of bread in a field of wheat, a couple of weeks into its growth. This too is a site that brings bread into being, but it's also a site that brings other things into being, a place with a history and a future, a piece of land that's tied to intergenerational family relations of wealth, labor, and kinship. This field is related to the bigger story of wheat and bread production, but that's not the only reason it exists. So rather than predetermining what this land is about as a narrative of possible wheat shortages or potential bread crisis might call on us to do, we can probe some of the other stories that reside in this space. So one of the things you might notice is how the wheat is planted in these straight lines along the ridges. This is called raised bed planting, and it's a completely different new way of planting wheat rather than just broadcasting the seed over a flat field. I visit this field with Walid, who's the agricultural engineer who developed the raised bed seeder that is a small, low-cost machine that has allowed small-scale farmers to plant their wheat in this way. Around 1.3 million acres of wheat are now planted in raised beds. Walid lists the benefits for me several times, a kind of mantra of this technology's wonder. Water savings, lower fertilizer usage, yields of almost 9 tons per hectare rather than the average of 6.8. Fields like this could hold the key to the nation meeting more of its needs, allowing the government to rely less on imported wheat. But planting this way is expensive. No doubt some farmers will be able to reap the benefits of these higher yields while others aren't. For my final bread story, I returned to Cairo to a stairway descending from the metro, to a woman with the products of her home baking. She's selling fatir, a sweetened pastry made of thin layered dough and ghee. In other small corners of the urban fabric, you find women selling homemade batao, a dry bread made with corn flour and flavored with fenugreek, or aish beiti, a soft, flavorful white flatbread, or ra'a, a thin, crisp bread. While the government-subsidized bread is so widely eaten, the presence of these women and their homemade wares speaks to the other breads that are in circulation. The fact that there's a market for these homemade breads, even though they are so much more expensive than the subsidized loaves, shows how people care what their bread tastes like. Even those with very limited means who rely on subsidized bread may occasionally purchase pricier loaves because they prefer their flavor or they remind them of rural childhoods. Beyond the single story of bread riots is the smell, taste, and texture of everyday life and why it matters. So, in shifting our starting point for thinking about bread to the space in front of a bakery or silo, field, or street corner, we learn something different. We see that the key issue isn't just one of the government providing cheap, decent bread to stave off the possibility of a bread riot, but of the everyday ways in which people handle that bread so as to maintain its quality. We learn that it's not just sufficient for the government to buy wheat, buy enough grain to supply this subsidized bread program, it has to find somewhere to store it. We understand the significance not only of Egyptian farmers planting wheat, but of how they plant it. And we recognize that Egyptians don't just care about having bread to eat, they care about having bread to eat that tastes a particular way. So to conclude, what we see across these examples, is some of the different stories that emerge when we change our frame of reference. When we move from national calculations of Egypt's limited water supply and growing demand to look at specific sites where decisions are being made about what water should go where and how it should be used. When we consider both those talking about climate change and how they talk about it, and those who don't. When we move beyond general statements about the risk of bread riots to think about the everyday practices that shape the production of wheat and bread, we see beyond the single story. And we recognize how a single story of crisis limits our understanding of the nature of the problem, its causal factors, and possible solutions. So the final point that I want to make is that placing the environment in Middle East studies shouldn't be about adding another string to the bow of crisis narratives about the region. We've studied terrorism and war, we've studied female disempowerment, now let's study environmental degradation. We can recognize the critical challenges without drawing an indelible pairing between the environment and crisis. The environment isn't just a problem space. And I want to give just 3 brief examples. Take, for instance, these shoots of wheat and barley emerging from the soil of Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. At this stage in growth, it's difficult to see the differences, but these research plots hold a range of traditional land races and varieties and wild relatives, some of which are no longer found in any farmer's fields. These seeds were stored in the gene bank of the International Center for Agricultural Research in dryland areas in Syria, where I spent a summer doing pre-dissertation fieldwork. When the Civil War forced the research center to close, scientists traveled to the Arctic island of Svalbard to retrieve the duplicates that they'd deposited as a backup in the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. Bringing those seeds back to Lebanon and Morocco, they planted and replicated them once more. These seeds hold the key to developing new varieties that can cope with a warmer world and emerging diseases. These shoots emerging from the soil are a sign that this genetic heritage hasn't been lost. Or if we move for a moment to the wetlands of Turkey, to these grazing water buffalo. In her recent work, Caterina Scaramelli details the care with which villagers in the Kızılırmak Delta engage with their water buffalo, naming them Yıldız, star, elmas, diamond, petting them, affectionately referring to calves as their sons, even as they'll then go on to butcher them. A care that resonates with the way in which people in the Egyptian village where I conducted fieldwork look after their water buffalo, the daily trips to pick clover to feed them, the evening milking to produce rich buffalo milk cheese, the joy when a baby gamusa is born. This is one just 5 hours old. Or moving to the streets of Cairo, we might focus on something like this: 2 innocuous water coolers on a table by the road. Sabils. As Tessa Farmer has written about, these new types of informal water sharing, which build on a very old tradition, are popping up around the city. Owners tend them carefully, washing them out each night, filling them fresh each morning, adding bottles of ice to keep the water cool. In doing so, they accrue merit with God for their labors while supporting the well-being of their community. Passers-by pause, take a sip, quenching their thirst and cooling down, a moment of respite in the midst of a busy city. I wonder then how our conversation at this conference might have been different if it was titled not Ecology, Crisis and Power, but Ecology, Community and Power, or Ecology, Care and Joy, or simply Ecology and Life. Shifting the frame would, I think, prompt a whole different conversation. It would direct us to think about other places in new ways, to consider the role of uneven power dynamics within a community in shaping who gets a valued resource and who doesn't, to appreciate the care with which people engage with particular parts of the environment, to understand how life goes on even in the midst of precarity. Now, I don't mean to deny the very real issues. In Lebanon, multiple diesel generators are required to keep that research center functioning in the midst of power outages that have become routine in the country's economic meltdown. In Turkey's wetlands, the buffalo's grazing lands are shrinking as pastures are turned into more profitable agricultural fields. In Cairo, one reason why Sabils have become so important is because of the uptick in summer temperatures, which is making the urban environment ever more hostile. So I'm not trying to romanticize. My point, though, is that we shouldn't flatten our consideration of this field to a problem frame alone, to limit our view to a crisis rhetoric that doesn't necessarily match people's day-to-day experience of living with and in the environment. We need to tell multiple stories. As Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie writes, stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. We need to reorient our lens then to the question of how people engage with different facets of the environment as they build their livelihoods, raise children, earn money, fall in love, have fun, mourn, and celebrate. We need to think about how they live in the midst of shifting ecologies. Thank you.